What did medieval street food actually taste like? Forget everything you think you know about ancient diets, because we're digging into the surprising origins and delicious preparations of long-lost recipes that sustained common people centuries ago. Prepare to have your taste buds time travel. Imagine walking down a narrow cobbled lane in a medieval town. The scent of sizzling fat rises into the air, mingling with the faint smoke of peat fires and the sweet fermentation of beer being brewed just down the way. Merchants shout, hooves echo on stone. And somewhere between the tannery's stench and the cathedral's incense, there's something savory, something ancient, something delicious. This is the world of medieval street food, not the bland, colorless gruel we've been led to imagine, but a rich and robust culinary tradition hiding beneath the soot of history. It wasn't just about sustenance. For the poor and rich alike, food sold on the streets was practical, flavorful, sometimes exotic, and always tied deeply to the rhythms of daily survival. Street food was essential. In cities where most homes didn't even have a private hearth, let alone a kitchen, eating out wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. Workers and travelers needed cheap calories, quick meals, and portability. But beyond mere convenience, these humble dishes reveal a forgotten layer of medieval life, one shaped by trade, season, religion, and the unseen hand of empire. And it all starts with the myth we must first bury, that medieval food was bland, unclean, and uniform. In truth, it was none of these things. Not when examined honestly, through the burnt crusts of forgotten pasties and the spice-stained pages of ancient cookbooks. Take, for example, the ubiquitous medieval pasty. Not the Cornish version modern tourists know, but a whole range of handheld pies that were, in many ways, the original fast food. Filled with chopped meats, onions, dried fruits, or even sweetened cheese, they were wrapped in thick, folded crusts, sometimes carved with family symbols or vendor marks, and baked in communal ovens across Europe. These weren't just for peasants. Nobles took them hunting. Laborers took them to the fields. Pilgrims carried them on roads that stretched from York to Rome. Or consider skewered meats, roasted on open flames in the city square or outside castle gates. Not just a carnivore's delight, but an efficient way to cook and serve multiple patrons at once. Bits of pork fat or spiced mutton, charred and dripping, were often served with hunks of black bread and pickled vegetables. Portable, flavorful, and wrapped in simple cloth or leaves, they prefigured the modern kebab or shish taouk, and may have even descended from Roman street fare. And then there were fritters, deep-fried marvels. Both savory and sweet, these were made from batter mixed with herbs, bits of fish, or fruits, and fried in lard. Some were dusted with sugar, others with salt and vinegar. These early cousins of the donut and croquette were favorites at fairs and feasts. And despite the presumed scarcity of ingredients, medieval fritter recipes show remarkable creativity, highlighting a palate more diverse than our modern preconceptions would ever allow. Yet the deeper question is not just what they ate, but how. What ingredients found their way into these makeshift roadside kitchens? And what do they tell us about the hidden networks of medieval life? It turns out, even the humblest vendor was part of a vast, unseen web. The medieval kitchen, especially the one that operated under open sky, was surprisingly global. Through the veins of the spice trade, cardamom and cinnamon made their way from the Levant to London. Saffron, though precious, could sometimes be found in fried sweets. Pepper, cloves, and nutmeg, costly, yes, but occasionally used even in common recipes in trace amounts, offered a glimpse of distant worlds. Some ingredients were closer to home, yet still surprising. Wild garlic, nettles, mushrooms, berries, and fermented grains added complexity to even the simplest pottage or hand pie. And innovations in preservation, smoking, salting, pickling, meant vendors could travel with their stock, selling to pilgrims on the move or visitors at town markets. The tools they used were equally humble and ingenious. Flat griddles set over clay braziers, spit roasting racks hammered together by blacksmiths, ceramic pots buried in coals. Many street cooks had little formal equipment, but a lifetime of experience. They measured by memory, cooked by feel, and passed down recipes orally, or in the margins of forgotten manuscripts. And those manuscripts, when they survive, are riddles in themselves. Recipes were rarely complete. Quantities were vague. Ingredients were listed with little explanation. It was assumed you knew how to cook, or that you'd watched someone who did. This makes recreating these ancient recipes today a form of culinary archaeology. What does a handful of hard cheese mean in a world without standardized weight? How hot is a fire enough for meat to sweat? What is the difference between fine powder and black spice? To answer these questions, modern chefs and historians must work like detectives, tracing linguistic roots, regional variations, and forgotten techniques. In our own attempt to resurrect one such recipe, we began with a 14th century mention of chouettes, small pastries filled with minced pork, figs, and ginger. We sourced coarse-ground barley flour, aged pork belly, dried figs from Anatolia, and fresh-cut ginger root. We rendered suet. We shaped the dough by hand, and we baked it in a wood-fired oven built using medieval-style clay bricks and insulation. The result was astonishing, not because it was delicious by modern standards. It was, but because it was different. Hearty, sweet and savory in the same bite. Crumbly crust, meaty filling, a strange, lingering heat from the ginger. It tasted like the memory of a world that once was. Not just food, but story. And that's what medieval street food really is, edible memory. Every bite a trace of someone's day, a butcher's surplus, a widow's income, a traveler's comfort, a spice merchant's gamble. A monk's fast day cheat. Food, sold in alleys, hawked in squares, eaten by hand, was more than nutrition. It was survival, community, invention. It was the heartbeat of cities, the fuel of festivals, the rhythm of time itself. And yet, the further we peer into these flavors, the more we realize they weren't just born of necessity. They were expressions of a hidden cultural intelligence. Systems of trade, hygiene, spiritual regulation, and even early forms of food safety all played a part. Vendors soaked their skewers in vinegar to clean them. Certain stalls were banned on holy days. Fines were imposed on spoiled goods. In the chaos of medieval life, there was order, silent, edible, and profound. This street food wasn't just the past, it was prophecy. It shaped how we eat today. Fast, handheld, diverse, and social. The line from the fritter cellar of York to the food truck in modern Toronto is shorter than we might think, but there is more to uncover. Because behind every lost recipe, every burned manuscript and vanished ingredient, is a deeper question still unanswered. What else have we forgotten? And that leads us to the next layer of the mystery, a hidden world of food that was not only delicious but deeply political, symbolic, and sacred. From esoteric cooking rites preserved by guilds, to ingredients that hinted at ancient pharmacology, to street vendors who may have been preserving lost traditions far older than medieval Europe itself, we must go deeper. To understand what was truly at stake with medieval street food, we must ask, why did so much of it vanish? Not just recipes, not just ingredients, but entire rituals of eating disappeared, overwritten, or banned. It's almost as if someone tried to erase this world. And maybe they did. You see, in the Middle Ages, food wasn't just food. It was belief, identity, power. And in the case of street food, where commoners mingled, gossiped, bartered, and tasted the world, it was subversive. These weren't polished feasts served in great halls. They were chaotic, unregulated, and alive. And that made them dangerous, because in those steaming stalls and smoky corners, peasants weren't just buying a meal, they were reclaiming agency. For a moment, they weren't serfs. They weren't beggars. They were customers, choosing what to eat, sharing recipes, speaking freely, passing information, legends, laughter, along with bread and stew. And this terrified the ruling classes. Consider the timing. The decline of urban street food coincides suspiciously with the rise of guild control, stricter religious oversight, and early proto-bureaucracies. Monasteries began to produce centralized food. Nobles pushed rural dependency. Church edicts regulated what could be sold and when. Inquisitions burned more than heretics. They scorched folk culture itself. In other words, when the food went, so did the freedom, and yet, echoes remain. You can still find them if you know where to look. Take the mysterious black broth of medieval Laconia, once whispered about in later Greek and Byzantine sources. Described as a stew so dark it was said to revive the dead, it was likely made of blood, vinegar, barley, and wild herbs. Why it was sold only by night near river markets in early Europe remains unclear. But some scholars suggest it wasn't just a meal, it was a ritual food, tied to seasonal transitions and symbolic rebirth. Was it a distant cousin of pagan offerings disguised as street fare? Or the witch's flat cake sold in French fairs? Before Lent, charred on one side, spiced with rue and juniper, and filled with mashed beans and ash-salted pork fat. Records show they were eaten before fasting began, often in secrecy. Later banned, vanished from markets. Why? Some believe these cakes were part of an ancient fertility rite that predated Christianity. Absorbed, then erased. In London, a recipe from 1295 references moon bread, round, sesame-crusted rolls painted with egg yolk and poppy, sold only during lunar eclipses. Their exact function remains lost, but accompanying notes describe them as tokens for favor and eaten for seeing. Vision bread? Was this symbolic sustenance, designed to awaken altered states or spiritual insight? Even humble pies weren't immune to symbolism. Some medieval hand pies were shaped not in half moons, but eyes, knots, and even labyrinths. Was this just whimsy or encrypted meaning? Certain crusts were carved with glyphs. Some vendors claimed protective powers against illness, hunger, or bad dreams. A pasty wasn't just lunch. It was a talisman, and this brings us to a more radical notion. What if food itself was a form of hidden language? In esoteric texts from the 13th and 14th centuries, often considered fringe, there are references to edible codes, recipes written in riddles, ingredient combinations meant to trigger memory, awaken intuition, or unlock the inner gate. Many scholars dismiss this as metaphor, but some believe medieval cooks, particularly among marginalized communities, preserved older knowledge through cuisine. Could street food have been the last safe container for ancient teachings? Consider the vendors themselves. They were often outsiders, widows, foreigners, former servants, many illiterate, but all deeply embedded in their communities. Their hands knew techniques passed down generations. They adjusted for weather, fasting days, market fluctuations. Their knowledge was embodied, tactile, experiential, and oral, and like oral traditions the world over, what they preserved could survive even in silence. There are accounts from 14th century Spain of traveling Moorish vendors selling fire syrup, a spiced honey drink served warm at crossroads. It was said to bring clarity to dreams. In Italy, dried cakes made of chestnut flour, anise, and crushed laurel were called pilgrim stars. In Prague, a fried dumpling filled with pickled beet and goat cheese was stamped with a seven-pointed symbol, the same symbol found centuries later in alchemical manuscripts. Are these coincidences? Or fragments of a larger forgotten system, culinary artifacts of a suppressed metaphysical science? Let's entertain the possibility. Suppose some medieval food traditions were rooted in a form of sensory alchemy, not merely nutritional, but transformational. A meal meant to harmonize the body, a flavor intended to sharpen memory, an herb mix designed to open emotional or spiritual awareness. It sounds fantastical until you realize this isn't new. The concept appears in ancient India, in Egyptian temple diets, in Greco-Roman medical cookbooks. Why not medieval Europe? It's likely that much of this was erased deliberately. During waves of religious reform, guild consolidation, and colonial standardization, non-canonical knowledge was purged. Spices were taxed. Recipes were gentrified. Oral traditions were silenced. And the street vendor, once a cultural conduit, became a marginal figure, eventually replaced by printed menus, standardized meals, and regulated commerce. But the echoes remain, in archives, in ruins, in stories. In a monastery ledger from 1432, there's a passing mention of a dish called the widow's cradle. It was sold outside the walls during winter and described simply as millet, almond, and the dreaming herb. What was the dreaming herb? No one knows. The recipe vanishes. The name never appears again. And yet, here we are, still searching, still wondering what was lost between the stones of the street and the silence of the scriptorium, still tasting the past in fragments, burned crust, faint spice, a name etched on a cracked bowl, because food, in the end, is more than a survival mechanism. It's a signal. Every time we unearth an old recipe, every time we try to recreate a medieval dish from a scribbled note or a faded mural, we are reaching back, not just for flavor, but for meaning, for the voices left out of the chronicles, for the street vendors who fed the forgotten, healed the hungry, and smuggled wisdom beneath the crust. And as we peel back the layers of buttered dough and vinegar brine, we must ask, were these forgotten meals simply recipes or something more, perhaps a kind of code, perhaps a spiritual map, or perhaps a final message left by cultures on the brink of erasure? Taste and remember. In Part 3, we'll venture into the modern world, where brave chefs, culinary historians, and spiritual seekers are attempting to revive these ancient flavors. But can they truly resurrect what has been lost? Or are they creating something entirely new, an echo of memory shaped by myth? To answer that, we must try it ourselves. Cook it, taste it, feel what rises, because sometimes the soul of a civilization isn't found in its cathedrals or its kings, but in a fried dumpling sold from a wooden cart in the rain. Reviving a medieval street recipe is an act of faith, not blind faith, but the kind rooted in evidence, sensation, and memory. A kind of spiritual archaeology. Because when we pick up where the past fell silent, when we stir a forgotten mixture in a modern pot, we're not merely cooking, we're summoning. And all across the modern world, people are trying to in a quiet kitchen in Yorkshire. A culinary historian carefully ladles out a thick lentil pottage spiced with marjoram and wild garlic, following a reconstructed recipe pulled from an old merchant's diary. In Croatia, a street chef in a coastal market sells honey-drizzled chestnut fritters wrapped in parchment stamped with a 13th century seal. In Boston, a food anthropologist slow bakes meat pies using hand-ground barley flour and tallow, recreating peasant meals from the Doomsday Book. Their methods vary. Their sources are fragmentary. Their interpretations, by necessity, are imaginative. But the intent is shared, to taste what time tried to erase. Still, the question lingers. Can we ever truly revive a lost dish? The ingredients may exist. The technique may be reconstructed. The setting might be simulated. But food, as we've seen, is never just about taste. It's about context, culture, emotion, symbol, the people who made it, the reasons they needed it. And yet, something does return. As one researcher put it, when I bit into that pie, for a second, I wasn't in the 21st century. I was someone else, somewhere else. It wasn't just a recipe. It was a transmission. That word, transmission, is key, because these recipes weren't just lists of instructions. They were containers. For memory, for survival, for encoded knowledge. And every time we attempt to cook one, we aren't simply looking backward. We're allowing the past to move through us. Consider the case of the Ember Loaf, an obscure dish found in both Scandinavian and Gaelic records. A small flatbread baked under ash, mixed with wild herbs and salt pulled from dried seaweed. It was eaten mostly during solstice festivals and often prepared by the village's oldest woman. Recent experiments recreating it have produced something astonishing, a bread both bitter and sweet, with an aftertaste that reportedly triggers vivid memories in some participants. Memories not their own. Of course, science would call it suggestion. Psychology, the brain filling in gaps. But for those who experience it, the feeling is real. Like something deep inside remembers what the mouth has never tasted. It raises a haunting possibility that our bodies carry more than genes, they carry longings. That in our bones, we know these flavors. We're just waiting to meet them again. And if this is true, if a pie or a stew or a fritter can awaken ancestral memory, what else might it revive? Might these ancient foods also carry forgotten wisdom about health, balance, resilience? Might they offer lessons our modern world has silenced? In recent years, some researchers have begun exploring medieval diets not just for novelty, but for insight. The pre-industrial digestion rhythms, the diversity of gut flora fostered by fermented grains and root vegetables, the natural antimicrobial properties of herbs used in even the simplest street stews, thyme, hyssop, mint, mustard seed. One group in Bologna is studying how medieval spice combinations mirror patterns in Ayurvedic and Eastern medicine. Another in Wales is mapping street food routes against ancient pilgrimage paths, finding that many food stalls once mirrored sacred geography. Nourishment and navigation fused. It makes you wonder, was food also a map? Did vendors unwittingly preserve ancient ley lines of memory and power, feeding the body and guiding the soul? Or perhaps these cooks knew more than we think. Perhaps they were the last folk scientists, philosophers in aprons, keepers of quiet truths. Their stalls, small temples of taste where forgotten systems briefly endured. And every time they fed a stranger, they passed on a little of that lost intelligence. A breadcrumb trail through time. Today, when we dig through soil-stained manuscripts and half-burned market rolls, when we taste reconstructed stews in controlled kitchens, we are not simply indulging curiosity, that we are searching for ourselves. And if there's one thing this journey has taught us, it's that history is never truly gone. It lingers in soot, in seed, in the shadow of a name carved into wood, in the way dough folds, in the taste of ginger that catches you by surprise. That to eat what the forgotten once ate is to touch their lives, their hunger, their joy, their resilience. It is to say, you are not lost. And in a world moving faster than ever, where taste is mass-produced and memory is fleeting, maybe the most radical thing we can do is slow down. Cook something old. Taste something once forbidden. Let the past speak again, not through words, but through the fire, the scent, the crust. Because the real secret of medieval street food isn't just how it tasted, it's what it meant. And if we listen closely, through sizzle and spice, we just might hear it whisper back. If this journey into the forgotten flavors of the past stirred something in you, an appetite for mystery, a hunger for deeper knowledge, then let the story continue. Like this video, share it with others who wonder, and subscribe for more hidden truths from history's